We're just going to give it about 1 more minute before we officially start, but feel free for those who are on to type where you're coming from in our chat box.
We appreciate that a great deal. Thank you.
And while you're at your computer doing that, please feel free to leave your camera on so we can see you. We'd like to have you discuss, share, talk, and be a part of this workshop as much as you can. So please feel free to do that as well.
Oh, Melis from Prince Albert.
Cool.
Somewhat north, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, we will get started. Welcome, everyone. We are honored that you have joined us this Thursday afternoon. My name is Michelle. I'm coming from you from Edmonton, Alberta, Treaty 6 territory. We got Aubrey Ann on, and she's from Saskatoon. She's going to talk in a moment. And then our amazing guests, Laara and Mark, they are coming to us from Vancouver, BC. So welcome. So we had a little pause on our webinar series, Links to Learning, for the last 2 weeks because Can-Do was hosting a conference. So I hope you got to participate in that. But now we're back to learning. We're back to taking in some good knowledge, some good information. So we welcome you to this afternoon's webinar. So there's going to be an evaluation at the end. We would love for you, your voice, your feedback is so important. We'd love for you to fill out that evaluation. I believe there is a prize. So if you do fill out that evaluation, your name will be entered to win a prize. So it's in your best interest. In the event you have some questions or comments throughout the presentation, please feel free to put it in the chat box. I know that there's going to be room at the end for question and answers and conversation and dialogue. So we'd love for you to participate in that way. We'd love to hear what you have to say. So we welcome you. We hope that you walk away feeling inspired and challenged and maybe some new thoughts and ideas brewing. I'm going to pass it over to my lovely co-host, Aubrey Ann.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. As Michelle said, the nice thing about these small groups is that you can interact. So don't be scared to do so. No one here judges. If you don't ask questions, I usually have a million, but I highly encourage you to do so. This is going to be an amazing presentation on effective development corporations and economic resiliency. I know I'm so excited. I, like always, have my pages ready to go and my notes ready. So yeah, without further ado, I'm excited to welcome our speakers. So here with us today, we have Laara and Mark. So Laara Yaghujaanas owns and operates Carden Consulting, which she established in 1997, and she is from the Haida Nation. She holds a master's degree from Royal Roads University, was awarded the Royal Roads University Founders Award, has completed the Justice Institute Conflict Resolution and Negotiation course, is a CTT certified consultant level 2, is a member of the Council of Native Development Officers, and is a member of the New Relationship Trust Economic Development Support Team. Very, very, very knowledgeable woman. I love listening to her speak. So much to offer. And also here we have Mark Salter. He joined Carden Consulting in the summer of 2017 as a business and life partner with Laara. Mark worked with the Songhees Nation to achieve their goals of developing successful intergovernmental partnerships and has worked with the First Nations in Ontario and gained more than 10 years experience working with and for First Nations. Mark has a deep level of respect for First Nations and possesses a wide variety of skills that has helped him to develop intergovernmental partnerships and has been recognized by the Capital Regional District and Governor General for environmental leadership benefiting the regions of Southern Vancouver Island. A key component of their work has been the purposeful planning to enhance the capacity and self-determination of Aboriginal peoples through community-owned research and tools. This indigenous methodology and approach has proven successful in supporting the self-determination of the Aboriginal parties, communities, organizations, and nations throughout BC, whom Laara serves. So both of these speakers are so amazing, a dynamic duo, if you so call it. Very impressive. I love hearing them speak, and I know you're going to too. So I'm going to let them get started because I know you didn't come to hear me speak. So welcome.
Thank you very much. Hadla isis akmens akde gudne lagan. Welcome, good people. I'm honored to be here today. My name again is Laara Yaghujaanas, Kunkayas from Yaghujaanas clan of the Haida Nation. And we'll be talking about effective development corporations and economic resiliency. We have a little bit of housekeeping that Mark can go over after he introduces himself. And we also have one of our team members down here on the IT, our communications coordinator, who you don't see, but is doing a lot of wonderful work down here, making sure that your chats are heard and we can communicate with you as effectively as possible.
Haishka, OCM Nishkwelakwa. Greetings to all our honored guests. I'm Mark Salter, born and raised in Victoria, Vancouver Island, and I've given you greetings in Lekwungen from the peoples living there. And we're happy to be here broadcasting from the bright shores of the Burrard Inlet on the north shore of Burrard Inlet in Tsleil-Waututh territory. We live and work amongst the Tsleil-Waututh peoples, and we're pleased to be amongst the unceded territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh nations here in the greater Vancouver area. Haishka Ocean. And Justin is here, and he is taking your chat inputs. He will put them up on a little prompt screen for us to read so we can get them interactive as we go along. And we can hear anyone talking through our earphones. So we're ready to go.
So today we're going to be talking about effective governing institutions, good corporate governance foundations, and what economic resiliency is, and some tips and hints on things that we've learned that help support long-term sustainability and development of development corporations, as well as helping to work through some of those challenges during times like this. So we will get started, and what we wanted to acknowledge right at the very outset is that on the next slide, you'll see what we quite often want to emphasize throughout this, is that they're effective governing institutions, your development corporations, as community-owned development corporations. They are not in the context of development corporations similar to what we see out in the Western world as a corporation. So a corporation is seen as an individual entity. When we have lawyers who've assisted with our nations in the past, I've only found one or two, and one right now that we work a lot with, who understands that ours are community owned. So the assets, the resources, the lands, everything that we derive to create these development corporations are those things held in trust from citizens. And as a community-owned development corporation, there's a responsibility to not only respect that, but also to incorporate their voice and to report back to them as well, which is well beyond the scope of a standard numbered company organization that most lawyers will just pull off the shelf and write. So what we're going to share with you today are a number of tools that we've garnered over the years in helping to establish or reestablish development corporations, and those roles and responsibilities that shareholders primarily have in setting off a development corporation or reestablishing it in a good way as community-owned development corporations.
What makes an effective economic development corporation for a First Nation is the governing institutions that manage it, respective of their role and accountable to their citizens, and responsible to establish and maintain good governance. That is one of those foundational pieces. And we also like to ensure that strategic measures are established by the leadership, which we now know as the shareholders, that is baked, one of Laara's favorite expressions, is baked into the DNA of the company. So as we build it to its articles of incorporation and or its business charter, as well as through its corporate governance policies, community economic development planning, and agreements for accountable membership-owned development corporations. So that's really important that this begin the foundation. We have these built right into this process. These are the types of effective governing institutions that are key characteristics of nation rebuilding.
And what we found is that when we go in to help communities, quite often their development corporations have gone divergent. and for us to help them get back on track. We find that these things we're going to go over today help for them to get back on track. It's one of many tools, but this is the most important. And these are usually things set by the shareholders, supported by the board of directors, and created and embedded, again, baked into the DNA of all the agreements: articles of incorporation, business charters, shareholders agreement, loan agreements, and repayment agreements. So there's a lot of legal work that has to go in. We all know the legal framework, that's best practices, your GP, LPs, and your trusts where necessary. But these, again, are the things that we always like to recommend get done to be able to improve the efficiency of each development corporation. One is setting the development corporation's values, and that has to be aligned with those values of your nation. Every nation has their own value set that are slightly different, and there's a lot of commonalities. But the one most significant commonality is that we as Indigenous people have collectivist values. That is to say that when we look at something, our worldview is that we consider our entire community as a part of that experience. Where individualistic worldviews and individualistic peoples from the US and European countries usually look at something in an individualistic view, saying, what's in it for me? Or what's in it for my family, or just my shareholders. They don't consider the whole, where we consider the whole as collectivist-based people. As a result, it affects the way the behavior of the organization is expressed. So it's really important to recognize the importance of values. Mandate, making sure that you have a very clear description of what is the purpose of this organization, your mission, how it's going to be done. Performance measures and limits. How do you know if you're successful or not yet? Competency matrices to recruit board members. So you have a standard minimum threshold of competency you want to make sure that that development corporation has to be able to operate. Shareholders and board member roles and responsibilities, which is most of what we're talking about, but differentiating a little bit more in that our description of that. Corporate governance policies that the board would set out to ensure that it aligns not only with the description and the mandate of the shareholders, but also to ensure that everything that the board could and should impact should be thought through and proactively developed to ensure good corporate governance. We have a whole workshop on that as well at another time. Community advisory to ensure that your assembly processes, whether they're traditional or contemporary, you have a way for voice of community to be a part of your day-to-day work and planning so that the needs of community and their interests are respected and upheld. And again, those agreements that we talked about that need to be cemented underneath that to reflect all of those things.
Strategic direction for a First Nations community-owned development corporation with inclusion into your business charter.
So I'll just say that this slide is just like a table of contents. These are the things we're going to go over in this workshop, followed by economic resiliency.
Principles and values. Values are those things that are the most important to us and how we perceive and behave in the world. They're developed from our family, our communities and societies, and our experiences are very unique to each and every single person and or society and or your culture. Distinct cultural values of our First Nations must be the foundation of your organization to be effective. Principles are often confused with values and are the ethics and morals that we evaluate our actions for the rightness or wrongness of them. Most First Nations have collectivist values, as Larry indicated earlier, whereas one views the world with a priority for the group over themselves. By contrast, Western values are individualistic, and they were prioritizing individuals' needs above those of their community. Given that values inform behavior, it is critical that development corporations have and behave consistent with your nation's values.
And when we take a look at it, if you want to read more about values, Gert Holstead spent more than 50 years now looking at nation-state values to understand the collectivist value set by Indigenous people around the world. It's a great read to understand how organizations behave. For example, collectivist-based peoples require higher levels of communication, shared decision-making, and issue resolution at the outset to ensure that that shared decision-making process and how they operate is supported. What we know, though, most importantly, is that when a community and or an organization has an agreed upon set of shared values, that means they've discussed with each other what are those things that are most important to them. Everyone's operating from the same worldview then. of these things are important to us, family is important to us, connection to the land, our laws of the land, all of those things allow people to see the world in a different way, or to remind them of how those values are important to the nation. When those values are shared and agreed upon and articulated, they inform the behavior of the people working in the organization and thereby the organization. What we found in research, and this is from Coos and Posner a few years ago in a book called The Leadership Challenge, is that when that happens, and this is where I got CTT level 2 certification, we have results that include revenue growing more than 4 times faster, rates of job creation 7 times faster, stock prices grow 12 times faster, and profit performance 750% higher. So we see these things explode when we put all of those energies to good use and have people align on what those things that are most important to them. So really important to be able to recognize that our values are critically important. And in the 21st century, we're seeing that around the world, where leaders all over, corporate, public, private, are all recognizing that this is one of the most important things in operating our businesses.
And our nation's organizations are unique in Canada, and those differing values must be the foundation of our organizations to be effective. And so we'll move into values development. So this is a workshop slide we use for helping you work and help develop your values for your particular organization and or community. A nation's community-owned DevCorps should also base their values upon their own language and culture. Therefore, values should be defined in your own language as much as possible. You're going to hear us emphasize language use in your own language quite regularly, as we believe that is a way to bring your cultural values into your workplace, and also creates a space for inclusiveness for those community members who would like to use their traditional language and have their traditional language and ways respected in your organization. When they see that being part of your value statement, the inclusion is much higher and people have a better alignment with their work.
And usually your own language will have a better reflection of the deep meaning and education and knowledge and identity that's embedded in it that can't ever be captured by English. For example, Musqueam, when I was working with them and we were doing this with their council, and Halmakamelam, they don't have a word for you're welcome, because thank you means that everything that you do should always be out of the goodness of your heart, never expecting anything in reciprocated behavior. So it's always just to give. What a beautiful way to look at and understand just a single word. And we see that all the time when we have and support that language development to be incorporated. Huge, beautiful learning inside of that. So what we have here are some examples of principles. Principles, again, are the rightness or wrongness of actions and behavior. So again, we have these things that we understand that are most important to us. And the principles are those things that we can say, that's, yes, we're trying to do this, but there are boundaries, things that are right and wrong and how they behave. So just to give you some examples of things worth considering in your discussions, again, as much as possible in your own language, some thoughts that might help inform the principles by which you would say that these things might be informed. So your development corporation should operate with the following principles, whatever they would be for you and your nation. 1 is consistent with your values. 2 is having that relationship with your citizens. Again, almost every nation we've ever worked with has some sort of language that reflects this interconnection and reciprocity that we have with our communities. Again, a collectivist based. So engaged citizens is critical. Again, respecting that as the citizens' assets and resources that are being utilized to develop the corporation and the economy. So having a relationship and reporting relationship to them is critical. Again, the primary function of your business is business growth and development. So having some discussion around what that might look like in terms of your culture would be critical. An aspect too that, of course, we know all too well in our Western world is the financial management aspect. And most importantly, in good governance is accountability. How are you going to be accountable in your development corporation to ensure that there's regular reporting back to citizens? Once you've understood their needs and interests, you go back to them to say, this is what we've done consistent with what you wanted to see us do. And again, as much as possible in your own language.
The purpose statement, which is the next portion of the process of putting your DevCorps together. Some keys that develop an effective purpose statement are: use such words as purpose or our intent is, to focus attention to the statement as the principal controlling idea for your development corporation. So having meaningful conversation about what it is you're going to do. Focus on why the development core is being established and what is the intended outcome. Is an example, wealth creation. So when we look at the concept of wealth creation, it has a larger a more holistic meaning, and as we like to indicate here. Wealth creation as defined by the First Nation may have been stated includes, but not limited to, the quality of your life, which includes your health status, your work-life balance, education and skills, social connections, civic engagement, environmental quality, personal security, and cultural well-being, and your subjective well-being, material well-being, your income and your wealth, and employment and earnings and housing, and sustainability of your well-being, the natural capital and economic capital and human capital and social capital in your community.
And that's just an example of wealth creation that we've seen a number of First Nations use in terms of defining what they'd like to see arise from development corporations. One good example is Member 2, who has ISO certification, has had people knocking on their door for the last 25 years wanting to do business with them because they have gone through this very clear process, including developing governance policies and operations policies to, at that time, an unprecedented level for a First Nation. Now it's much more common, but when we do reach those levels of organizational competency, we can put out and welcome the world to our door.
The reference to primary methods, examples of business development and diverse economic development, you've got to look at what your business is and what it could be. Refer to your constituents who is intended to be the benefit, and that's the current and future generations of your community. Ideally, the entire purpose statement is in your own language with an English translation following. However, as English, we do encourage that you use your own language and provide it with general working definitions. But again, we've had experiences where we've sat down with leadership and created a bit of a purpose statement, a mission statement, a vision statement, and all of a sudden the coming together of one or two words that was common in the community's language meant the whole process fell in place almost instantly. And the entire leadership at the table could recite their entire vision and mission statement in their own language by the end of the day. So that was a meaningful transformation for them because they knew that the one or two words that they all held in common gave them the connection that they needed. It implied all the meaning that they needed and wasn't too complicated.
So just to give you an example of how we use this type of purpose statement. So the Can-Do Development Corporation's purpose is to realize wealth creation through business and economic development or economic diversification for citizens of the Can-Do Nation. So you're really trying to articulate something very, very clear as your goalpost to go forward. And again, wherever possible in your own language.
Goalpost metaphor, we're going to continue with performance measures and getting that ball in the goal. Some tips of the DevCore to effective performance measures. And what you measure really matters. Just try to remember that. So you got to make sure the things you choose to measure are significant and have meaning.
So before we start that, I just want to explain, these are a sample of performance measures or intended outcomes that we've assisted nations with over the last, for myself, 25 years, for Mark, quite a number of years. And we've seen over the last several years, these remaining consistently the same. So this is the ones that we like to share because we hear them over and over again. It's the same things that nations want out of their development corporations. And they're good examples. So we just want to pass that along.
So the focusing on why the DevCore is being established is critical. What are the intended purposes, the outcomes? Wealth creation, as defined earlier, as holistically, which many of our community clients have stated includes, but not limited to, being consistent and sustainable financial benefits that ensure the DevCore's sustainability and reinvestment back to the nation. Foundational material. Skills and training and employment and contracting opportunities for nation citizens. So as your DevCore grows, it's got to bring people in, train them up, move them through, and lead them into a career in a management and leadership positions in your businesses. And then, of course, ultimately have enough capacity in your development corporation to encourage other small business opportunities for your community members to serve your DevCore. One example would be a forestry company that has a community member who builds roads, and they help that person develop a road building business. So therefore, there's more resiliency in their business operations for the community. Sustainable development and management protection of your territory. You want to make sure that whatever endeavor you go down the path of, it doesn't take away from the natural beauty of your community and erode the future potential for your community members. Developing hard and soft infrastructure as part of your DevCore's business plan. So if you are going to be building roads or bridges to do your work, wherever the business is, that's an infrastructure piece that benefits your community. And then the soft infrastructure that follows that, power lines, communication lines, then serve your community as well, because now we've made room for that to come in. And then by supporting cultural vitalization through inclusiveness of language and customary laws and practices into your business, you're going to get cultural vitalization as a result. And then, of course, protecting the use of intellectual property. An example is traditional knowledge or customary laws or protocols. And if you're into the tourism business and you're wanting to share some of your community stories and some of your particular parts of your territory, having this discussion with your elders and your leadership people so they can appreciate what is they're comfortable sharing, and that everyone understands the meaning of what's being shared, and there's no doubts about how it's going to be shared. Having that all done ahead of time, critically important as part of your development of your business.
And the other part of that is what is sacred and what do you not want to share, and how do you protect it?
And we agree on, it triggers to agree up front on what those are, and as Larry indicated, how to protect it so that it doesn't come out inadvertently or someone doesn't get knowledge that they shouldn't have. And of course, the nation's citizen capacity building, understanding and training employment contracting and small business development to help diversify your economy and, more importantly, create greater self-sufficiency amongst your community members. That's a critical performance measure that you can put onto your DevCore.
So what you want to do is every single business opportunity, you put this filter on it and say, to what extent can we maximize the outcomes for this joint venture, for this business venture, for this idea? And that allows you to maximize those intended outcomes for the entire development corporation. So when we take a look at performance measures, again, that's something that could be included into the shareholders agreement, the business charter, any number of agreements, but those are the two most common. And what we find in performance measures is that there are ways for us to demonstrate progress. This is how we can say we've realized success. How do we know we're successful? We know we're successful when we have X number of dollars in the bank, when we have a percentage of members who have been employed by the development corporation, or a number of percentage. We can start to measure these things, and rather than being subjective, we now have objective or visible or ways we can measure tangibly what are the outcomes to the development corporation's work, which now we can pin to be able to say we are achieving success because we can report on these outcomes we've realized. Good performance measures allow employees to get motivated and focus their attention on those things that are most successful for you to realize progress, which means that they get more energized, you reward them on those things, and you get greater progress. And it also helps to support transparency and accountability and good governance, because leaders can have that strategic conversation around those things that are the measures that they have to ask, not subjective ideas around the shirt you wear that day or any of the details that they shouldn't be a part of talking about as leaders. It allows them to have a strategic conversation. Did we realize our 5% return on investment this year? If not, how come? And let's do better. So when we take a look at performance measures, it's also important to think about them themselves and how you define them, because inadvertently, sometimes you can have a performance measure that's not as effective as perhaps a new updated one. So for example, if you have outcome X instead of outcome Y that you were hoping to achieve from a performance measure, you can then, when you ask how come, you can start thinking about, was that measure the right measure? And when you look back at what you're trying to achieve, update those as you need to as well as a part of your annual planning. So when we talk about performance measures, one of the things we talk about is that canoe that you just saw too. And it's one way for us to express the idea, which I missed completely on that slide, is if we were to say we're taking a canoe from point A to point B, there are several stops along the way that we have to make. And those performance measures, if we think of them as a metaphor, are those ways for us to tangibly say, we've reached the first point, everything's a go, we're doing well, or we're behind. But we can look at those measures. We know what they're going to be, and we know what everyone expects them to be, and we know that we're all heading in the same direction. And then point B, point C, until we get to our final destination. It makes it really clear when those performance measures are there, so we know what direction everyone's heading. And it provides a sense of safety and security for staff, employees, and assurances to the citizens.
Everyone's in the canoe together, achieving the same goal. And if you take that metaphor into your office place, if everyone on the team knows that the strategic goals and objectives are visible and are easy for people to comprehend, they can have ownership in them, everyone has a real sense of team building going forward. So keeping them visible and sharing them regularly and successes along the way is really critical.
And they should be collaboratively developed. So those people who are responsible to actually realize them, the ones who are paddling, can say it's reasonable to be able to paddle from here to here in 2 hours, not in half an hour. That's just unrealistic. So you have realistic and achievable performance measures.
And that team is in the canoe helping to make that happen. Performance and control measures, leaders must maintain control to be effective. And the development corporation needs latitude to make decisions, therefore. Leadership must establish effective control mechanisms that prevent meddling or micromanaging and support an arm's length relationship. Build the fence, not get inside the fence. These control measures focus attention on ensuring the planned outcomes are realized while also keeping communication to a strategic level. Leadership must control all it must, not all it can. Learn the difference. Council, leaders, and shareholders' role is strategic and must be disciplined to determine what must be achieved, not how it's to be achieved, which includes setting the strategic goals, put the limits on the activities and the conduct and methods that are deemed to be unacceptable, and monitor and ensure the intended outcomes are realized. The most effective strategic monitoring is progress through performance measures. So we go back in our canoe, we've all agreed we're going to make it to the village across the bay, and we know that in order to get there, we have to go on 2 particular points of land, and we all agree that we should be there before the tide changes and before we have lunch. So that's everyone agreeing on it. I'm not going to be worried about what stroke pattern or how many strokes a minute one of the paddlers is working about, because they've agreed we're going to get to these places, and they're going to use whatever methods they've been hired to do to get there. So I'm staying out of the way and doing my part, steering the canoe. The strategic goals and objectives that are set through the mandate, well, the limits are established in the articles of the incorporation and the DevCorps governance policies. We're going back to that again. And community economic development plans should be completed similar to as you do for a comprehensive community plan, based upon the needs and interests of your community.
So when we take a look at the next slide, it's just some really simple examples of how we now measure that. So performance measure, for example, it's easy to know that in terms of sustainable financial profits and revenues arising from the DevCorps would mean a dollar figure. We'd be able to easily understand that our net profits are an increase of 10% per annum. That's easy to understand. The other one is capacity development, skills training, and employment and contracting could be measured in terms of number of positions trained, number of people employed, number of people retained in employment, number of small business contracts awarded to nation citizens. So you can start to see and understand how you can use those specific outcomes to start to measure what the performance of the organization looks like. And again, those should be mutually and collaboratively developed with those people responsible to realize those so that they are realistic.
So nothing about us without us. Okay, everyone in the room that's part of the process of success should be part of the conversation. But one of the measures is, not just the jobs or the types of jobs, but how many people were transitioned from an entry-level job into a more skilled job or a management style job. That's a measure you can put some success to.
Now, all of this, I'm just thinking, and all the workshops we've done, we talk about these things that shareholders have to do to set the canoe off in a good way. And it sounds like a lot, but when you actually work through these, we've done this in one day with Chief and Council and going through a lot more information than this too. So it's not terribly difficult, but what it does is it lays the foundation for, again, good articles of incorporation, shareholders agreement, and business charters that ensure that the DevCorps is set off in a good way. So really, really important to do and not terribly difficult, just a lot of thoughtful preparation. So when we take a look at the next piece, board competency matrices is again something that should be established from not only the shareholders, but also supported by the board of directors. And that usually is a combination of individual and collective competencies that make up the leadership team. And it's something that you can use to not only do the call for, but do your interviews for, identify annual capacity assessments of your board to say, do we have the people we need to have on board to do our best work? And those usually include, as a best practice, financial skills and competencies, corporate law competencies, so you can understand a corporate document, a legal document. You don't have to be a lawyer, but you have to understand it. You can always hire lawyers, but you have to have some base understanding of what that means. Business skills. And again, it can be formal or informal learning. You've started a small business and you have some skills there, but for a larger development corporation, you have some boards of directors who maybe have MBAs and that kind of experience. First Nations understanding, meaning that your local First Nation, the context in terms of traditional governance, community makeup, relationships, assets, resources. There's an understanding from your community around what that means for community members and the nation as a whole. And of course, your business experience as it relates to those primary industries that you're looking to pursue. So if you have a large part of your development corporation invested in forestry, you want a forestry expert on your board of directors. If you had a large number of holdings invested in tourism, you want someone who has expertise in tourism on your board. So also making sure that when you leadership is established or reestablishes, that you define what that matrices looks like. And again, including doing an annual review of that in your governance policies to say, do we have the right team at the table? Processes to recruit board members usually includes shareholders, understanding that they have a responsibility for legal appointments. That means the final approvals, but the board normally should make up the lion's share of looking at doing the call consistent with the competency matrices defined by the shareholders, but also making sure that they have the right team internally as well. When that call is done, quite often we have a lot of shareholders or chief and council wanting to see representatives from community, which is great and that's fine, but there still should be that filter of what are the competencies. It's similar to what we said before, buying a car and then putting someone in the driver's seat who has no ability to drive and doesn't have a driver's license and just puts a lot of energy and money into something that can't actually work as effectively as it should. And often we haven't seen many nations that actually have the time and money to train and practice to have people go to driver's classes. You need some people who can be the Ferrari race car drivers, or at the very least, be able to drive that vehicle that you're using for your development corporation to get it doing what it's supposed to do, fulfill the purpose for which it was created. So you have to have some baseline competencies, which include those ones we just shared.
Shareholders and boards' roles and responsibilities. We just touched on it momentarily. This slide is very good because it breaks it down into shareholder board responsibilities, the board's role and responsibilities, and you can see how the citizens and the shareholders and the board, the chief executive officer or general manager, and the operations sort of relate to each other. So the shareholders and role and responsibility set the strategic direction of the development corporation through expanded legal documents, articles of incorporation, shareholder agreements, business charters, establishing the values, principles, and purposes of the DevCorp, purpose and scope and limits, identifying the substantive issues and outlining reporting requirements. Limits are placed upon corporate governance policies, establishing board selection criteria and approved legal appointments for new board residents, and then monitor the boards for compliance performance measures. So important to make sure that as a shareholder, you're making sure the board that you've hired is doing their job. The board's responsibility is establish the mission statement and consistent with the mandate set by the shareholders, establishing good corporate governance policies and practices, including direction reporting requirements that align with those set by the shareholders, and then hiring the senior manager, which we'll call the GM or CEO, and then monitor the operation performance through the CEO or general manager to adhere to the operations policies. And we're going to be judging this person's skills based on their adherence to operational policies, their plans and performance measures, and how well they're reporting that back to us. That's how we're assessing that person's responsibilities.
Now, just quickly on the shareholders piece here, we are talking, all of this is about the shareholders' responsibilities and what they have to establish to set the strategic direction. Again, this is the biggest failing that we find, is that lawyers will be hired to establish or reestablish development corporations. They pull a numbered company off the shelf, they fill it out, and it's set up for it to be operating in the same way a Western development corporation would, and that's just accountable to shareholders. No one explains to the shareholders what their real responsibilities are in making sure that they fulfill the full function and purpose of the development corporation. And that includes setting the strategic direction and monitoring the performance of the board and the development corporation. So the shareholders actually have a lot of responsibilities, including, most importantly, that it is understood that it's a community-owned development corporation and that they are ultimately also responsible to report to citizens, not just shareholders.
Can't emphasize that enough. Good corporate governance foundations. Get ourselves started off. Effective governance institutions start with comprehensive governance policies. So we're going to make sure the foundation of our business has good operational capacity through comprehensive governance policies. Leadership is responsible to lead at a strategic level by developing, implementing, and monitoring culturally relevant laws, policies to fulfill the nation's vision, protect Aboriginal rights, and safeguard all the nation's assets for the benefits of all citizens. To achieve this purpose, bylaws, policies, and procedures should be developed by leadership to address governing effectively, managing the senior manager and monitoring their operations, engaging with citizens to get solicit feedback. So it's really important that there be a method of sharing what's going on, and then also receiving feedback from what the community feels about what you've sold them, coming back to the corporation. Undertaking an annual strategic plan and updates based upon citizens' goals. So ask a question, listen, and put it back into the plan, and then do that on a regular basis. We suggest minimum quarterly.
So this is an example of what your nation should have in terms of good governance policies. Similarly, again, good leadership is good leadership is good leadership. Corporate governance policies are the exact same with some additional pieces like board competency and recruitment. Those types of things have to be added, but generally the same 4 quadrants apply. How does the DevCorp do its internal work as a board? The second one is, how does it relate to your senior manager or your CEO? The third one is, of course, how does the board relate to the shareholders and citizens? And the fourth one is, how do you undertake planning and accountability and reporting? So those are the 4 areas that all leaders have a potential to impact and affect positive change, and those should all be thoroughly thought through and written down on how they should happen, those agreed upon rules for the nation and for the development corporation to realize its intended purpose.
Part of that engagement is through an advisory committee, and we're going to outline a little bit of the community's advisory committee. As a community-owned DevCorp, a community advisory committee is an excellent method to build capacity of your community and support small business development and economic diversification. As community members get involved, they get to see how the business works, and then have an opportunity to create their own business opportunities. We know that it's important that small business development drives 98% of our provincial and federal economy. However, our nation's rates of small business development range from 2 to 15%. It's a fraction of what it should be. And without it, we can't develop a thriving economy and support self-sufficiency. A community advisory committee would have a terms of reference as recommended by the shareholders and supported by the board, and should include a code of conduct, how to deal with conflict of interest, as well as clearly stating the purpose of their advisory committee, that they're not a decision-making body, and they explain what resources they have available to them to meet to achieve their goals, and then they have an obligation to report back as well. So, figuring out how often and who they speak to is part of developing that committee.
Now, this could be something as simple as an advisory committee, but ideally what you want to do is also take a look at your culture and your traditional and customary laws and practices. So for a lot of nations, they had extended family heads as either heads of family, ULCM, hereditary chiefs. We don't use that term very often because chiefs is actually a French term. It's not ever been associated with indigenous language. But taking a look at who those leaders were in your communities and how would they have used their governing systems previously to make sure every person's voice in the community was heard. Those have been taken away as a part of the imposed INET governing system. But this is a really important way for us to revitalize it. So again, at the very least, an advisory committee, ideally one of your own customary protocols and practices in terms of engaging citizens into having their voice reflected. So the final one we have here is agreements, and that means that in terms of, again, we talked about your articles of incorporation, your shareholders agreement, business charter, loan agreements, repayment agreements, all of those have to be aligned and say the same thing. Primarily everything we've shared, but that it is responsible and accountable to citizens, not just shareholders. And it's important that council as shareholders are really clear on their function and role as well. So they get used to putting on the right hat at the right table and don't confuse not only themselves, but the community. So really important. So we're going to get into next, economic resiliency.
Better quality institutions are associated with a higher growth and lower fragility, otherwise known as good governance, is associated with higher growth and lower fragility.
We take a look at economic resiliency. The biggest component to it is that we are diversifying our economy, but in terms of what we know works really well for corporations in how they behave. I really like this model that we're going to share with you today because it is a very holistic model developed by Peter Senge called the Learning Organizations. And it was called in a book called The Fifth Discipline. We actually have it here. Just Mark keeps saying he has it on his desk. He literally does have it on his desk. The Fifth Discipline. It was a book that I read as a part of my master's degree. And I really like it because it's so holistic. And the first component of it is to make sure that you have your own leadership skills developed, including personal mastery, to be able to master your own learning conversations. So asking questions, being compassionate in understanding when someone doesn't quite make that goal or achieve that performance level that you have set out, ask why. Understand and help them to learn so that they can do better next time. Those types of conversations. Developing shared values and vision in indigenous world mental models so that people understand the worldview within the organization, average and learn not, that they can be supported to understand what this development corporation is intended to do in a cultural foundation. Supporting the ongoing team learning, including developing systems thinking. So supporting the capacity development of your team to start thinking about in terms of systems. And it's something that is very, very easy for us. I've taught systems thinking at post-secondary level quite a number of times in terms of understanding, for example, a fish habitat, and you understand the systems that affect it. So thinking about in your community, in your conversation, in your development corporation, what systems are at play, and starting to think that way. And empowering and undertaking community economic development planning for long term, and making sure that there's a process focus rather than just a task focus. Expecting and implementing learning adaptations, meaning that you ask what happened, you didn't quite realize those goals. What did you learn and how can we do better next time? And transformations based upon those realities. So again, what are those realities that may have reduced your performance or may have affected the work of the development corporation? And listening and requesting unbiased feedback and establishing feedback systems. So Jana Sikamus was asking, what are you mastered in? And that means personal mastery, so that you have an ability to govern your own emotions and thoughts, to be able to do your best work as a leader. And so when we take a look at this, it's speaking to shareholders, board members, senior managers, anyone who is supervising other people to be able to support the development of learning organizations, as well as even staff to be able to say, I understand that we had this performance measure. These things came up as unexpected changes in the environment or working conditions, and I was only able to achieve 3% return on investment because of this, and this. What we learned from this is X, and we're going to incorporate that into a new practice of how we do things and how we adapt how we do things to do better work next time. So you can teach up as well using the learning organization approaches. I hope that answers your questions, Jana. And when we take a look at this image on the right, you can understand in his description how all of it works together, being able to create a organization that has that very holistic, compassionate, humble understanding. And I always think of Elder Joan, who we worked with for a long time at Saskatchewan, and she always said, you learn from cradle to grave. And that is that humility to say that we're all learning. There's no one that has all the answers, no one ever will. And it's those leaders who are really successful in learning organizations that have the humility to say, I don't know everything. And if we didn't get there, how come and what can we learn from that and how can we do better next time? And so that's what we're trying to encourage in developing economic resiliency, is constant learning as a team. So I hope that gives you a bit of a description. If you want to look online, there's a lot of information. If you look at the fifth discipline, Peter Senge, or learning organizations, that will help you to understand how you can apply that further.
There's a lot. All right. Developing economic resiliency, the Dev Course, community economic development strategy planning research, includes identifying industry trends and opportunities and develop businesses that are diversified and support that resiliency. This includes developing a wide range of experts to work as part of your team and a risk mitigation strategy. This must be supported by good governance at a corporate level with policies that set out how engagement should happen based upon customary laws and practices, and reinforcing effective feedback systems, which we just talked about. And by an advisory community of citizens that lead the planning. So again, building their capacity to perform as leaders in that area, and empowering and supporting that team and citizen learning for the benefit of the whole and for future generations. So now you've got a group of people, young and old, who now have skills which will benefit your community. And ultimately become disciplined and accountable and transparent leadership committed to good governance, including effective monitoring of performance measures and supporting a learning organization, creating that reporting and feedback loop, and then learning to adapt from what the information you've received and make changes accordingly.
And we really wanted to emphasize that first part because I've seen so many times where we have a small group of leaders get into a room and they don't do any secondary research. They don't look at industry trends. They just get in a room and they brainstorm and do popcorn brainstorming around what they want to do with the DevCore, and they expect it to work. So for example, one of the things we're going to talk about, what we saw on Vancouver Island is a group of leaders who did this. We weren't a part of the project. We heard about it, where they developed a multi-million-dollar aquaculture business, never talked to anyone about it, never talked to their citizens, most importantly, about it, put a lot of money and energy into it for a few years to developing the aquaculture business. No one had the expertise or even wanted to work in the aquaculture business, and they had to shut it down. So a lot of energy and time wasted because they didn't do their homework, including not only looking at the world around them and what's going on in that industry, but also taking a look at what their citizens wanted. So it's really important to look beyond the parameters, the external environment and what's happening around the world. So when we take a look at developing economic resiliency, again, we do come from a very grassroots approach, and we do know that it works. So when we engage citizens, community economic development planning, or CEDP, supports knowledge-based decisions. So if I know that we're going to be establishing a mall, a retail mall, and I have an interest in having a small store, or even if I have, the twinkling of an idea of this, I now can start to dream and think about what I want to do as an individual to participate and benefit from that Community Economic Development Corporation potential business opportunity. So now I'm a part of it. Now I can actually help to support my training, my small business development, my participation in that economic opportunity, and my self-sufficiency. And what happens is we have this huge awareness and growth that in the mainstream in BC, Canada, and every single province drives and is the backbone, 98% of the backbone of our economies. And in our communities, it's about, again, it's a small percentage, 5 to 12%. So we have this huge gap around how we can support that economic diversification by introducing people who are citizens and have a stake in it. Some other ideas just to help engage citizens and help support their small business development opportunities is to have training, equity matching, sharing those plannings, and that sometimes means advocating to understand and share those opportunities associated with business ventures, reporting on success of citizens and your business ventures because success breeds success, developing skills inventory studies so you can speak to every single person to say, what are your needs and interests and how you'd like to develop yourself, and how can the development corporation align those interests to get the best out of everybody. Developing RFPs, that means writing all the stuff up we just talked about into an RFP and inviting the world to come do business with you. It's amazing how many times we've seen corporations who have the same values want to come work, and they'll find you to be able to do work with your nation rather than us begging for crumbs. Let's open the doors and invite the world to come work with us. Also promoting a development corporation, whether it's your ISO certification like Member2 did, or business to business match kind of things, or regional advocacy, developing the organizational capacity, and then letting the world know about your corporation.
And what will be the uniqueness of your business and who you are that will attract people to you in a way that you want them to be?
So we have some time for questions and answers. Now we appreciate having some feedback and clarification on some of those. We'd really like to hear from you, sharing ideas, asking questions, any information that we can share further, or if we could improve this workshop, please let us know. We're going to leave a couple minutes here to ask questions of you. And you can do that through either unmuting yourself and chatting with us, or you can develop your comments into the chat room, and Justin's here to read them and convey them to us so we can help engage with you.
Because we too are a learning organization. We need to know. And we'd love to hear from you. Any thoughts or comments at this time?
Now, just to describe, this is not an awkward, we call it pregnant pause.
Hello.
I have a question, sorry.
No trouble.
In reference to the RFPs, do you have like a draft or a template that we could use?
Yes, I can send that over to Elizabeth and she can send it over to you. What I've done before is when we have in BC something called the Ministry of Aboriginal Relations and Reconciliation, which is now not MAR, it's MER. And I worked with the minister there to develop years and years ago, my gosh, 20 years ago, an RFP template for First Nations to use that is aligned with the provincial BC bid system. So you can put it out and then ask the province to share it as well. So it literally can go around the world and you don't have to do as much advertising. So absolutely, I'll send that over to Elizabeth to share with you.
Good. So we have a very strict business model, and so we always encourage our dev corps when they're looking in terms of whatever that business development model that they're going to put in place. A lot of times our dev corps are starting their own businesses. So we can talk about one of our local First Nations through their group of companies. They establish additional companies underneath the dev corp. And so a lot of times we find, and this isn't the right way to do things, but it ends up being like a shell corporation. And I know that that's caused some problems sometimes. And we always advise also to try and keep with your governance structures, keeping it separate from politics as much as possible. And so I do appreciate, what you were talking about with that advisory group. And it's not that you don't want chief and council's input and direction, but at the same point, because of the changing factors within First Nations, sometimes it's only 3 years, whatever those kind of things are. And it's really important, I think, to establish more of a long-term, that you're in here, through everything. And so I just wanted to make those type of comments.
Yes.
I missed the initial part. I was in another meeting and I apologize. So I'm assuming that this presentation will be shareable. Is that correct?
Yes, we'll have it in a PDF for you.
And the webcast itself will be available from the Can-Do website as well.
Okay, excellent.
Relationship between council and your board. And we worked with Dr. Stephen Cornell, and I've known him for years. And one of the things that we heard from him several years ago was that he really regretted how his comment around that separating business from politics, he didn't use that exact language, how that term got coined and used and misrepresented the interests of what he wanted to say. And that is, should have an effective working relationship. And that relationship is defined by all the documents we talked about, clearly defining and laying out everything we just talked about in a shareholders agreement, business charter, articles of incorporation. Everything allows you to proactively think through what this should look like. And it does mitigate all those risks you just talked about. So when you do have shell corporations, one of the things we've developed and used a number of times is a business development policy. So you can't develop a business without having gone through a few due diligence pieces, like a checklist of things that you have to do before you can even start one. So you have a policy like that saying you cannot go ahead and do this until you've got a business plan, that you have proven viability, you have equity, you have a whole bunch of different factors you can say that it aligns with the intended outcomes of the development corporation. A number of different pieces that says you have to check all these boxes off before you even think about opening a business under any of our holdings.
One of the other comments, and maybe you guys are familiar with this, but especially around training and employment, like us in Saskatchewan, we have access to like provincial training dollars, funded training dollars, but only if you're a nonprofit. And so our Dev Corp is aligned with our tribal council, and there's pluses and minuses to that because we are a wealth generation. We are focused on profit and making money, and that's what our investment side is. But with the training side, we end up having to go to a fee-for-service model because with provincial funding or grants, do you know if Dev Corps do have access to funding and grants for training and employment?
Well, you do, and you do have some funding from ISK, but what are you in the business of, right? And so this is what we talk about sometimes with our dev course. If you have ancillary opportunities to engage, for example, a security company, and you need your ground secured, hiring a company and looking for a company that'll provide the training to the standard and quality that you want, and developing agreements with them so you still have your end deliverable, but you benefit from that agreement to have those trainings incorporated, because you don't want to be everything to everyone. So training organizations are great because they specialize in training. And we've seen a lot of development corporations that want to achieve those training outcomes, which is great, but are they in the business of training? And if they are, sometimes that's great. Yes, you can actually do some training as a for-profit. There's a number of different organizations here that do that. But if it's not the primary function of your development corporation or your business entities, it's better to contract that out and make sure you get a really well thought out agreement. And again, invite and set out an RFP so you can take a look at what those opportunities are. You can certainly do it. And you can even have a society incorporated within your development corporation, because that's permitted now.
Mm-hmm.
But it's, think about what the purpose is, what is it intended to do? If it's meant to be something that is to fulfill your outcomes, is there a way to do where you get expertise to come in, or you're trying to recreate the wheel and you end up spending a lot of time building organizational capacity in training, which might take away from your other interests.
Okay. And one final ask, and I know that you're out in Vancouver, but are you aware of any communities of practice where dev corps or CEOs or people who are in the position of establishing, where they can come together in some sort of a knowledge sharing or a shared platform to kind of address not so much the in the weeds details of like, oh, I'm buying into Patricia Crow's business, but some of the general challenges? Or
that would be lovely to see. And for our part, we've been advocating and working with some of the local BC leadership to develop something called an indigenous, or we haven't quite defined the term yet, indigenous or leadership development association, to do sharing of best practices. But there certainly is a huge national gap in that area. Similar to a kind of chambers of commerce that was discussed for a long time as well. Really, again, the purpose and the intent of that is sharing of best practices to build capacity and understanding and communities of practice that help lift everybody up. And there is a gap right now in that area. I suggest you to continue to look. We are hopefully going to make some progress on our end, and we'll share with you what we can. CanDo certainly does have the opportunity. So if CanDo's listening, I think that's a great idea, building a community of practice where you can share those best practices on a regular basis, help each other out, mentor each other. It's certainly a huge gap and a need. Thank you for bringing that to light.
Just a reply to Jana. We have the book, as you can see it on your screen. It is The Fifth Discipline. It is Peter Senge. Google that term. You get a little bio on Mr. Senge. There's a few videos online. He's actually speaking in some YouTube conferences. And it's a great read. Great way to share with your community is some of the videos you can find online. But this is the book, and it's available on Amazon. You can download it for $14.95. I just did it an hour ago.
And Danielle wanted to share with you that we do have a recording of this presentation that'll be available on the CanDo website, along with the PDF PowerPoint of the presentation today as well. So thank you all for your great questions and feedback. We love having this opportunity. I wish we had more time to have these conversations, because we know that the capacity needs to be there. We know there's a lot of amazing people doing this work, and we want to support them. And we hope to see you again in our paths cross. But we know and respect that everyone committed to 2 o'clock close. So we do unfortunately have to close at this point, but you do have our contact information if you'd like to reach out and call or email us at any time. In the meantime, just wrapping up, thank you very much from both of us. It's an honor. We always enjoyed being a part of the CanDo team, even for a short while, in terms of supporting capacity development and self-determination of our people. And we'd like to ask for Michelle possibly to help close us off in a good way.
Wow, well, Keenan and Scompton, I thank you for sharing your expertise. So we give thanks for another day, Creator. We give you thanks for the sun, the sky, the clouds, the land, the sacred waters. We give you thanks for all of life, the animals, the plants. We give you thanks for all of our relations. We hold close our family and our loved ones. We thank you for the elders in our communities who bring their knowledge and their teachings, and may you continue to give them strength. And we think of our children, that we would be protectors of our young ones. So in all of our circle, we give thanks for the gifts that you have given to us. So may you walk today, the rest of your day, in a good way. May you hold hope, love in your hearts. Hi, hi.
OCM.
Thank you everyone for coming. Have a great rest of the day.
And
Thank
we're
you.
just to check in with Jana, which I was wondering about that question. Laara's master's is in leadership from Royal Rose University. That was the answer to the question that you were looking for earlier. And it is very helpful.
And was asking my question, has been Bachelor of Science, Indigenous Environmental Science be beneficial to this area? Yes, absolutely.
Always
you.
help. It's good.
Thank you.
Peace.